Okay, so picture this. You're standing on a line. But get this. On one side is wealth, opportunity, the good life. And on the other side, poverty and just constant struggle.
Sounds kind of crazy, right?
It does. But this line actually exists. It cuts right through the city of Nogales, separating the U.S. and Mexico. And that's exactly what we're diving into today with Why Nations Fail. This book uses Nogales as this powerful example to figure out, why are there such huge differences in wealth between countries?
Yeah, it's a question a lot of people have.
And the authors, they argue it's not geography or culture or even just dumb luck that creates this gap. It's something called institutions.
Right, and to really wrap our heads around this, let's actually imagine you're in Nogales, Arizona. What would you see there?
So in Nogales, Arizona, you'd probably see families earning a decent living, kids going to school, things you'd expect.
Right, a relatively stable life.
Yeah, people generally feel safe,
Safe, secure.
Exactly. But then you cross that border into Nogales, Sonora, and boom, it's like a different world.
It's a stark contrast.
Totally. Incomes plummet, healthcare is scarce, even starting a business feels almost impossible.
It makes you wonder, why is there such a difference when they're practically in the same spot?
Right, what's going on here?
And that's what the authors of Why Nations Fail want us to question those easy answers we usually jump to, like, oh, it's the people, or it's some cultural thing.
Right, like some kind of inherent difference.
But they're saying, hold on, it's more about the rules of the game in each country.
Those institutions.
Exactly.
So not just, laws on paper, but...
It's deeper than that.
Yeah, the unwritten rules, too.
You got it. Institutions are both formal, like laws, property rights, that sort of thing, but also informal social norms, how power is, actually wielded.
Okay, so it's like the underlying systems that are in place.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Institutions create incentives for how people behave. If you know the rules are fair and you'll be rewarded for hard work, you're more likely to invest in your education, start that business, take risks.
It's like, why bother if the deck is stacked against you?
Exactly. But when those institutions are in place,
it allows for more people to thrive?
Yeah, it creates that foundation for a thriving economy and a more prosperous society. But when you have institutions that concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a select few...
That's when you see those disparities, those huge gaps.
Exactly. And that takes us back in time a bit. The book actually dives into the Spanish conquest to illustrate this.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. We've got conquistadors like Cortez and Pizarro.
Right. And these guys were laser-focused on extracting wealth.
Gold, silver, anything they could get their hands on.
Anything and everything. And to do that, they imposed institutions that reflected that mindset, like the encomienda system.
Okay, for those of us who might need a little refresher on our Spanish conquest history, what exactly was the encomienda system?
So imagine you're an indigenous farmer, right? You're working the land, trying to make a living. But under this system, you're forced to hand over a huge chunk of your harvest, your labor, all because the Spanish elite, they claimed this land as theirs.
That's rough.
It was. And it really stifled any motivation to, improve or try new things.
Because any extra effort just benefits those in power, not you.
Precisely. It creates this environment of stagnation.
That's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
It's not a recipe for progress, that's for sure.
No, not at all. And it's not just a one-off thing with the Spanish conquest. This pattern, what the authors call extractive institutions, it's like a recurring theme throughout history.
Right, it's like a broken record.
It keeps popping up.
And it always has the same impact. These institutions, they're designed to benefit a small elite at the expense of the majority, which, obviously hinders economic development for everyone else.
It's like this vicious cycle.
Exactly. And it's hard to break free from. The authors, they call this path dependence. Like the past casts a long shadow. Even when everyone kind of knows that change is needed, the momentum of those old rules, those old ways of doing things, it's just really hard to overcome.
So while all this is happening in South America, the English are busy setting up shop in North America. Did they follow the same playbook?
Well, they tried to. Think about Jamestown, those early colonists. They also dreamed of striking it rich.
Finding gold, exploiting indigenous populations.
The whole 9 yards. They even tried to capture Chief Powhatan, thinking they could just, recreate the Spanish conquest playbook.
But things didn't exactly go according to plan, did they?
Not quite. You see, they encountered a very different reality in North America.
Yeah, they weren't exactly dealing with the Aztecs or the Incas, were they?
Right. Those densely populated empires, ripe for exploitation in the eyes of the conquistadors, they just weren't there. Imagine trying to force a sparse population into labor when you can't even find them.
It's like trying to play a board game with half the pieces missing.
Exactly. The English colonists quickly realized that those dreams of quick riches through exploitation,
Not gonna happen.
not a chance.
And they learned that the hard way. Didn't they have those stories about starvation, desperation, even cannibalism in those early years? Talk about a wake-up call.
It was a harsh reality check. It forced them to completely rethink their approach.
So what did they do? Just pack up and go home?
Well, they could just give up, right?
Yeah.
They were kind of stuck. They realized if they wanted to survive, let alone thrive, they needed a different strategy.
They couldn't just rely on brute force and exploitation.
Exactly. They had to incentivize people, not coerce them.
And how did they do that?
Well, you have to remember, in Europe at this time, land ownership equaled power. But in the colonies, land was abundant. But labor, that was scarce.
Interesting. So the colonists, they had something valuable to offer.
Exactly. They had leverage.
So the colonists had more bargaining power than the elites were used to having.
Exactly. They used that leverage to push for different institutions.
Right.
Like, one fascinating example is the head right system.
Okay.
So basically, new arrivals, they were granted land.
Oh, wow. So it's like, come on over, we'll give you a piece of the pie.
Exactly. It attracted settlers, and it incentivized them to invest their labor and resources in the colony's success. Because now it's their success, too.
That makes sense.
It created this feedback loop. More settlers, more land under cultivation, more prosperity, and therefore even more incentive for people to come join in.
Wow. So it's like this completely different mindset from being forced to work on someone else's land with little reward. This almost sounds like the seeds of democracy right here, like just out of necessity.
You're on to something. These early colonial assemblies, while they were far from fully democratic, they gave colonists a voice, some control over their own affairs, which again, stark contrast to the centralized top-down control of the Spanish colonies.
Right. It's like, who has the power?
Exactly. And remember, it wasn't that the English were inherently, more noble or democratic. These institutions, they developed because they fit the circumstances. They helped address the challenges those early colonists faced.
It's like necessity is the mother of invention. But in this case, it's like necessity is the mother of different institutions.
I like that.
Okay. So by the 1700s, you've got these two very different models playing out, extractive institutions in Spanish America, and then something new, something more inclusive emerging in the English colonies. Then, boom, late 1700s, birth of two very different nations, the United States and Mexico.
So did these different institutional paths, did they influence how each country kind of shaped its future?
Absolutely. When we think about institutions, it's easy to just focus on those formal ones like constitutions.
Right, like the stuff that's written down.
Exactly. While those are important, obviously, they're only as good as the institutions that actually uphold them. And those are shaped by history, by power dynamics.
So it's like a constitution's like a rule book.
Yeah.
But the game can change depending on who's holding the cards. Precisely. Take Mexico, for example. Their independence movement. It wasn't driven by this widespread desire for a more democratic society. It was largely driven by the elites who benefited from that Spanish colonial system.
So it's like Spain, you're out. But as for the power structure, we'll keep things pretty much as they are.
Pretty much. And it's interesting because when Spain itself adopted a more liberal constitution in 1812, the Cadiz Constitution, it actually caused quite a stir in Mexico.
Really?
Yeah, because the idea of popular sovereignty and limiting the power of the elite, that was terrifying to those in charge in Mexico.
Wow. So they're like, no, we're good with the way things are.
Exactly. It just shows how change is often met with resistance, especially when it threatens those existing power structures.
It really makes you think about how history could have unfolded so differently if those in power had made different choices.
Right, and the authors of Why Nations Fail, they don't shy away from these what-ifs. They argue that history, it's not predetermined. It's a series of choices that are shaped by institutions.
So it's not just this inevitable march of progress. It's like there are these forks in the road.
Exactly. And the path taken it has a huge impact on where you end up.
Okay. So we've got these two new nations, but they're different institutional paths. They continue, right?
They do. In the U.S., the 19th century sees this explosion of innovation. Think about the patent system, people like Thomas Edison, coming from humble beginnings, ending up with over 1,000 patents.
That's incredible. Imagine the potential that's stifled in societies where people don't have that opportunity to innovate. But even with a great idea, you need resources, right?
Exactly. You can't just will it into existence.
That's where banks come in.
Exactly. In the U.S., you see this competitive banking system emerging. It allowed even those from modest backgrounds but with good ideas to get access to credit, bring their innovations to life.
Which is huge because otherwise it's just like a nice idea, but it never actually
Right,
materializes.
it just stays an idea. And this was a stark contrast to the banking system in Mexico.
Which was still controlled by a select few, right?
Yeah. Yes. And again, this difference, it wasn't about one group being inherently, more or less virtuous. The authors, they really emphasize that these outcomes stemmed from the incentives created by the respective institutions.
So,
A competitive banking system. It encourages risk-taking. It encourages investment in new ideas, which is vital for economic growth.
So while the US is over here like fostering innovation and a more inclusive economy, Mexico's kind of stuck with the system that only benefits a small elite.
Yeah, unfortunately.
hmm
And even though Mexico went through those periods of reform, revolution, those deep-rooted inequalities, they just kind of stuck around. And to really drive this point home, the authors compare Bill Gates and Carlos Slim.
Oh, interesting. Because they were both at one point like vying for that title of richest man in the world, right?
Exactly.
So how do their stories kind of reflect these different institutional paths?
Well, you've got Bill Gates, right? The classic American tech entrepreneur. He builds his empire through innovation, competition, even facing those antitrust lawsuits because his company was so successful.
Which is kind of ironic, right? It's like, you're playing the game so well that we need to double check the rules are still fair.
Exactly. It shows a system of checks and balances on economic power. Now, contrast that with Carlos Slim. He built his fortune primarily by acquiring monopolies.
Like Telmex, right?
Exactly. Mexico's privatized telecommunications giant.
So instead of creating something new, he's profiting by controlling access to something that already exists.
Yes, and this is where those institutional differences are really stark. The authors argue that Slim's success was very closely tied to his political connections, allowing him to kind of navigate the system, secure those favorable deals. And it's interesting, when he tried to apply similar tactics in the U.S., it didn't really work.
Because the rules of the game were different.
Exactly.
It's fascinating to think about these two figures, both incredibly wealthy, but the paths they took, the systems that allowed for their success, completely different.
Totally. And it shows how institutions aren't just about economics. It's about power. Whoever holds that power can shape the rules to keep their advantage, even if it hurts the country as a whole.
It's like that saying, power corrupts.
Huh.
But in this case, it's like the institutions themselves can become corrupted by those in power.
Right, it creates this vicious cycle that's really hard to break free from.
Which leads to the big question. If we know that these extractive institutions are so harmful in the long run, why don't countries just change them?
That's the million-dollar question. The authors of Why Nations Fail, they say it comes down to incentives. Those in power, they have very little incentive to change a system that benefits them, even if it's in everyone else's best interest. They're doing pretty well, so why rock the boat?
It's like being stuck in a rut. You know there's a better way, but the effort to get out of that rut just seems impossible.
It can feel that way. And it's not just about individual leaders being good or bad. It's about recognizing that they operate within a system of incentives that are created by institutions. So to create real lasting change, you have to change those institutions. You have to shift those incentives.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into why nations fail, I'm left with a lot to think about. It's giving us a new lens to look at global inequality, and it highlights just how powerful institutions are, how they can shape societies for generations.
It's not just history, though, is it? These dynamics are still playing out around the world today.
Exactly. So if institutions are the key to a nation's success, then understanding how they work, how they can be changed, that feels more important than ever.
Absolutely. It requires us to think critically about the institutions that shape our own lives, our communities, our world.
So it's not just about understanding why nations fail, but how we can help them succeed.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're not just passive bystanders in this story. We all have a role to play.
That's a powerful message to end on. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. We'll see you in the next episode.